On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the law Trump used for his sweeping global tariffs, was unconstitutional as a tariff mechanism. Canada celebrated. Doug Ford called it another important victory. Poilievre called it a step in the right direction. Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc said the decision reinforced Canada's position that the IEEPA tariffs were unjustified all along. The headlines read like a clean win. Except for one thing. The tariffs that are actually hurting Canada the most were never touched by that ruling. A 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum is still in place today. A 25% tariff on Canadian autos and light trucks is still in place today. A 10% tariff on softwood lumber is still in place today. The Supreme Court struck down a weapon Trump wasn't even using on Canada's most critical industries. The weapons he was using are still loaded, still aimed, still firing. And understanding the gap between those two things is the single most important thing for any Canadian worker, business owner, or investor to grasp right now. So let's go back to the start. When Trump returned to office in January 2025, he came in with a tariff architecture already built across multiple legal authorities, not just one. The first layer was IEEPA, the 1977 law he invoked to impose 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports in March 2025, citing a fentanyl-related national emergency at the border. He later pushed that to 35%. But those tariffs only applied to goods that didn't qualify under USMCA rules of origin. And since roughly 90% of Canadian exports to the U.S. are USMCA compliant, the real-world bite of IEEPA on Canada was always smaller than the headline rate suggested. The second layer is the one that actually matters, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. This is a national security tariff authority dating back to the Eisenhower administration, and it's been broadly upheld by courts, including during Trump's first term. He used it then for steel and aluminum. He used it again and escalated it in June 2025. Raising steel, aluminum, and derivative tariffs from 25 to 50%. Softwood lumber tariffs rose to 45% under the same mechanism. 25% tariffs landed on autos and light trucks. 50% landed on copper. None of this came from IEEPA. None of it was covered by the February ruling. None of it is going anywhere because of that decision. Norton Rose Fulbright, one of the world's largest law firms, confirmed this the same day the ruling came down. The sectoral tariffs remain untouched. 50% on steel and aluminum, including derivatives, with no CUSMA exceptions. 25% on autos, light trucks, and key parts. 50% on semi-finished copper, again with no CUSMA carve-out. 10% on timber and lumber. 25% on upholstered furniture, kitchen cabinets, and vanities. These are legal under current U.S. law, untouched by the ruling, and they're the tariffs doing the most damage to the most exposed parts of the Canadian economy. Poilievre said it as cleanly as anyone on the day of the ruling, a step in the right direction. But tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos remain and continue to inflict real damage on Canadian workers. That's arguably the most honest read of where Canada actually stands. A step, not the destination. Now the scale, because these aren't abstractions, they're paychecks and plant decisions. Combined Canadian steel and aluminum exports to the U.S. hit $35 billion in 2024, about 1% of Canada's entire GDP, all now facing that 50% wall. And steel and aluminum aren't finished consumer products, they're inputs. They flow into auto parts, construction materials, machinery, even food and beverage packaging. A 50% tariff on metal isn't a tariff on one sector. It's a cost increase that ripples through nearly everything Canada manufactures. Autos carry their own version of this. The North American auto supply chain crosses the Canada-U.S. border an average of 7 times before a finished vehicle reaches a dealership. Layer a 25% tariff on the finished vehicle on top of tariffs on the components and materials at each stage, and you get a cascading cost increase that hits Canadian auto workers, American dealers, and ultimately American consumers paying more for vehicles built in a more expensive supply chain. Doane Grant Thornton, tracking this as of June 2026, lays out the current state precisely. The 50% rate holds on core metals, while most derivative products shift to a flat 25% on full customs value, though certain industrial and electrical grid equipment gets a temporary 15% rate through the end of 2027. Restructured, in other words, not removed. Some of it more complex, none of it lighter for Canada's most exposed industries. The Montreal Economic Institute put it plainly the day of the ruling. Great news for free trade globally, but limited impact on Canada specifically. Steel, aluminum, and lumber sit under a completely different legal mechanism. And the bigger fight, the Institute's Gabriel Giguère argued, is the USMCA review, not the court case. That review was supposed to deliver a renewal signal by July 1st. It didn't. It's now in an unpredictable annual review cycle that the Globe and Mail has described as a genuinely new and uncertain phase of continental trade. Canada hasn't simply been waiting for courts to fix what legislation broke. The Carney government has built a parallel domestic response. Counter tariffs on U.S. steel, aluminum, and autos remain in place. See $15.6 billion worth. The Buy Canadian policy requires federal contracts over $25 million to prioritize Canadian materials, naming steel and lumber specifically. Rail freight rates for Canadian steel and lumber dropped 50% through federal coordination with railway companies, helping producers stay competitive domestically, even as U.S. market access shrinks. $1.2 billion went directly to the lumber industry. Over $100 million funded work-sharing programs covering up to 26,000 workers in tariff-hit sectors. These aren't small commitments. They're real fiscal capacity being spent to absorb shock, but they're not a fix. Work sharing and sectoral funding buy time. They don't erase a 50 or 25% cost disadvantage that no domestic subsidy can fully offset, and there's more coming. TD Economics maps out the remaining toolkit clearly. Section 232 stays in force on metals, autos, and lumber. Section 301, currently aimed only at China, is now the subject of investigations the U.S. Trade Representative launched in March 2026 into 60 trading partners, Canada included, over enforcement of forced labor import bans. If those findings go against Canada, Section 301 tariffs could follow. Meanwhile, the 10% Section 122 global surcharge Trump imposed right after the IEEPA ruling while exempting USMCA compliant goods expires after 150 days, creating a tariff cliff on July 24, 2026, right when new Section 301 tariffs are expected to fill the gap. Fasken, one of Canada's top trade law firms, told clients exactly what to expect. With IEEPA gone, the administration will lean harder on its remaining sectoral tariffs as leverage in the USMCA review, pressuring Canada and Mexico for concessions the IEEPA route can no longer provide. The Supreme Court took away one weapon. The administration still has others, and it's positioning to use them. Here's the deeper truth the victory coverage glossed over. The IEEPA ruling matters. It's a genuine legal and symbolic win that sets real limits on presidential tariff power and validates Canada's argument that the emergency tariffs were never justified. But the tariffs actually deciding the economic fate of steelworkers in Hamilton, auto workers in Windsor and Oshawa, and lumber producers in BC are Section 232 tariffs. Legal before the ruling, legal after it. They stay legal unless Congress acts, a new trade deal removes them, or a future administration chooses to lift them. The Tax Policy Center estimates that even fully eliminating IEEPA tariffs with no replacement would only cut the average household tariff burden by about 8 percentage points. A relatively modest number precisely because so much trade was already USMCA exempt, and because the Section 232 tariffs that remain are concentrated, high rate, and applied to huge trade volumes. That's the real iceberg. The court only chipped the tip, which brings it to the negotiating table because that's where this actually gets resolved now, not in court. Canada's chief negotiator, Janice Charette, has been explicit. Canada wants these tariffs removed in the USMCA review. Clear mandate. But the Trump administration, having lost IEEPA, now leans more heavily on Section 232 as its core leverage in that exact negotiation. The tariffs the Supreme Court left standing are now the administration's best bargaining chip, meaning the path to removing them just got harder, not easier. Duke University law professor Timothy Meyer summed up the strategic bind well. In Carney's position, he'd expect a better deal in 2029 than in 2026. That reflects where things stand. Section 301 tariffs landing July 24th USMCA in an annual review cycle instead of a clean renewal, a U.S. administration facing midterm pressure while still holding Section 232 leverage. It's not the moment for Canada to take a deal requiring major concessions, but waiting 3 years isn't free either, not for workers living inside this regime today. So here's where it lands. The Supreme Court win was real. The Section 232 tariffs are also real, and they're the ones actually setting the terms for Canadian steel, aluminum, auto, and lumber workers right now. The USMCA negotiation that decides whether those tariffs eventually lift is heading into its most unpredictable stretch in decades, with a hard deadline on July 24th. Given that Canada is leading the G7 in per capita investment and creating jobs at 3 times the American per capita rate, real leverage, should Canada push hard for tariff removal now, accepting whatever concessions it takes? Or hold the line, let U.S. midterm pressure build, and wait for a deal that reflects Canada's actual position, rather than the administration's current maximalist one? Less than 4 weeks to that deadline. The next chapter's already being written.